There are many among us who in the past closed their eyes to events abroad because they believed that what was taking place in Europe was none of our business, that we could maintain our physical safety by retiring within our continental boundaries. To those who would not admit the possibility of the approaching storm, the past weeks have meant the shattering of many illusions.
This is America.
With a third of Europe now under Nazi control, America still sits on the sidelines. Many believe the war to be Europe's problem. Recalling the horrors of World War I, the majority of Americans don't want to get involved in another European war. President Franklin Roosevelt attempts to convince them otherwise. On September 16, 1940, Roosevelt signs the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. All able-bodied men between 21 and 30 must register for military service. Though Congress approves the bill, it is careful to call it a national defense measure. The draftees may only be sent to defend American-held territories. 2 years ago, the United States had the 17th largest army in the world, smaller than tiny Romania's. And almost 2/3 of American recruits have never fired a rifle. By the summer of 1941, Hitler is ready to launch his forces further east. In June, his armies invade the Soviet Union. By September, they have captured over 1.4 million Soviet troops. In November, Germany, Japan, and Italy renew their military alliance. All agreed to safeguard their common interests. The Axis powers are ready to carve up the world.
This is America.
Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation.
4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. It is the first and only time Hitler actually declares war on another nation. Across the U.S., panic spreads as Americans realize they have enemies off both coasts. Surging above the fear is a wave of patriotism and outrage. Within 30 days of the attack, over 134,000 young men enlist for service, ready to take the fight to the enemy. The wars in Europe and Asia now merge into a single gigantic world war, the largest war in history.
This is America.
Well, D-Day was obviously the most important single fight of that war. And of course, had we lost it, there's no telling what the outcome would have been.
Since the American entry into the war, American generals had been agitating for an opportunity to fight the Germans directly. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, represented the cutting edge of this offensive.
Essential condition that underwrote the success of D-Day was the fact that Germany had been bled virtually to death by fighting on the Eastern Front for several years against the Red Army in the Soviet Union before D-Day ever happened.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in. And they knew that they could inflict appalling casualties on the first units ashore. Well, somebody had to do it. And so the soldiers went, and indeed, those first units did suffer very high rates of death and wounding.
There's one thing to go on a beach with sand dunes. It's something else when you've got enemy on top of these bluffs. And for some reason, naval gunnery was either off or something went wrong there. They couldn't destroy those gun emplacements.
But eventually, the weight of the invasion took hold. The numbers of Americans, the numbers of craft, allowed the Americans and the British to establish a beachhead. And once they established a beachhead, then they could bring more and more soldiers and equipment ashore.
One thing I don't think either the Japanese or the Germans really counted on was what it meant to come up against a massive capitalist industrial power. The ability to build stuff on a massive scale with massive numbers was just something they hadn't really anticipated.
If you look back at the old photographs and the footage of that armada out there off the coast, I don't think they've ever assembled before or after anything like that.
Eventually, it was the technology, it was the weight of American weapons that tipped the balance. But at the very beginning, it was the soldiers, the ones who splashed ashore, the ones who knew that in the first wave, lots and lots of them would never come back. And those are the ones who made possible everything that followed.
The Rangers who went in first and the waves that came after them stood right up to it. And there was more bravery that day than one can hardly imagine.